community, our Eritrean brothers and sisters. They're not new to us. They've become part of the Eritrean journey. So today we have Mr. Eugene Purrier, we have Ms. Ann Garrison, we have Ms. Raina Malik. Sorry. Rania Kalik and Mr. Simon Tasfamariam. Yeah, go ahead, clap. Adetat silazevulna elilta yellen ማለት you. Abotatna elil ayvlun diyorum, I don't know. So, you know, we've heard a lot from their perspectives regarding colonialism and imperialism, and today they're going to focus on the struggle or the fight against colonialism and against imperialism. So I am going to ask that for anyone here who may not have heard of you guys, but I don't think that's possible, but just in case, we might have one or two. If you could please tell us about yourselves before you go on into your speech, that would be great. Once they tell us, do their presentation, the panel will do self-discussion, we'll do a self-led discussion, and then from there we will have question and answer period. So without further ado, to our great panelists, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabile. Hey everyone, I'm Simon Tasfamariam. I am the Executive Director of the New Africa Institute, and I have a background in medicine and sort of took a very different turn actually during medical school and afterwards, you know, in this fight against imperialism. Really, the fight goes further back to my teenage years, and in particular in college, be learning to organize within the Eritrean community and connecting with a lot of different progressive groups, being active in organizing the community in Seattle, and then moving on to, you know, the national level, and then connecting back home, going back home, doing my service there, civil service, and you know, really being back there, working back there, you are, by just doing that, fighting imperialism, in my opinion, because the entire country is in this fight to develop itself, to, you know, to be the master of its own destiny. The people are fighting for their, you know, social justice and fighting the good fight in the world, in a world where there are certain nations that do not want these developing nations to, you know, to come up and have a sovereign path, fight for their people, for you know, eliminating poverty from their society, and you know, fighting for social justice and all these good things. And so by going back home and participating in that, I learned so much, and it you know, made me the person who I am, continues to develop me and all these things. And so I then brought a lot of that work back here into the States after living there for roughly 2.5 years, and that experience has helped me to figure out how to bridge the divide between the diaspora and the folks back home, and we're all collectively fighting this fight together. And so I've had a wonderful chance to connect with so many amazing people. In particular, you're seeing them to my right here. And over this past year, with the year and a half, this struggle in the Horn of Africa that has united the Horn of Africa, this TPLF war essentially against the Horn, and it is a proxy force for the United States, which is an imperialist force, unfortunately, in this world. And so I've connected with them and many others, and I feel as though Eritrea is on the cusp of something great. And I'm so honored to be working with them and to be, you know, doing this stuff. And so it's an honor to speak to you all today and share some of my and our experiences in fighting against imperialism, and I will pass it on to Raina.
Thank you, Simon, and I couldn't agree more. I have nothing but an insane amount of admiration and respect for the people I'm sitting next to, and I feel honored to be sitting here with them, and also honored to be able to be here addressing you. This conference, this festival, has been incredible, and your community is so incredible and warm and inviting, and I've actually just never felt more loved and at home than I have the past few days, so I want to thank you all for that. And so I'm Raina. I'm a journalist at Breakthrough News with Eugene, and I host a show there called Dispatches. I also write articles sometimes, and I'm based in Beirut, Lebanon. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I got engaged in the struggle against imperialism, and that really has to do with my background and how I grew up. But I want to start that off by just noting that Israel is currently bombing Gaza again. Now, for those who don't know, Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, where 2.1 million people spend their entire lives and mostly aren't able to leave because they are stateless Palestinians. 80% of them are the descendants of or are actually refugees who were kicked out of present-day Israel in 1948 for the crime of not being Palestinian. They are probably the poorest and some of the most oppressed people on earth, and they have almost no defenses, and they're currently being bombed by one of the most well-armed and powerful countries in the world, armed with our tax dollars in the United States, by our country. And so far, several children have been killed. And, you know, this is one of the reasons I got engaged in the struggle against imperialism, because my family's Lebanese, and I grew up witnessing my parents' country being bombed by Israel with their own tax dollars from the US funding the weapons that were bombing their families. And that's a part of imperialism. Israel is a client state in the Middle East that serves American interests. It's like the TPLF of the Middle East. It's like America's police in the Middle East. And so that, and also getting into independent media, which was, you know, really a gateway for me to leftism and anti-imperialism, is why I'm so passionate about this issue and about really, you know, what's also happening in the Horn of Africa, what's happening in Latin America. Imperialism is the primary contradiction. It's about keeping the global south, keeping developing countries, some of the richest countries in the world. This is where the world's resources are. This is where the world's oil is and the world's gold is. It has the world's most fertile land. It's in Africa, it's in Latin America, it's in the Middle East, it's in Asia. And the former colonial powers, under the system of imperialism led by the United States, maintain this disgusting, brutal, unequal system that keeps our countries, keeps Eritrea and Lebanon and Syria and Latin America and all of Africa and all of Asia as divided as possible and as weak as possible, so they can continue to steal our resources so that they can keep a small elite in America and in Europe rich. And that's the system that we live under, and that's the system that I think we're all fighting. And so I think what's happening in Lebanon and Syria and Palestine and Venezuela and Cuba, the blockades and the sanctions and the bombing campaigns, this is totally connected with what's happening in Eritrea. It's all a part of the same system. And we have to look at it that way and see it that way. So the resistance that Eritrea is pushing back against imperialism, that resistance is connected to what we're seeing in Palestine, pushing back against imperialism. It's connected to what we're seeing in Cuba. It's connected to what we're seeing in Venezuela. These are countries, they're small, and you know, they're not the wealthiest countries. They're wealthy in resources, but they're all under sanction. They're weaker, but they're standing up to the biggest bully in the world, and that's why they're targeted with sanctions. And that's why at the end of the day, you know, it's so important what you all are doing in your community. It's so important, I think, what I'm doing in the Middle East. It's so important what people in Latin America are doing. But I'm so inspired, not just by all of this resistance to imperialism, but I'm inspired by the fact that we're moving towards a world where these countries are starting to see each other. They're starting to recognize that we have a similar struggle, especially as we enter this sort of multipolar world with the rise of China and Russia, where we have alternative partners to the US. So I'm deeply inspired. I got to visit Eritrea last year. I'm so inspired by what I saw there. I recently got to visit Cuba and Venezuela. I'm so inspired by what I got to see there. And I hope as we all learn more about each other's struggles, we're able to connect more and connect those struggles. So at some point, hopefully, we can push back against this brutal and unequal system together and, forge a path into a more prosperous and equal world. Thank you so much.
That's going to be hard to follow. I am, no doubt, far and away the oldest person on this panel, if not in the room and at the festival, because I can remember the Vietnam War. When I was 15 years old, I got into a kayak and paddled out into Hood Canal. This is in Washington State. I grew up in a Navy town where aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines are all repaired at the Bremerton Naval Shipyard. So when I was 15 years old, I got into a kayak and paddled out into Hood Canal to try to stop an aircraft carrier on its way to Vietnam. I didn't do it alone. There was a whole string of kayaks, rowboats, skiffs. We went out and formed a line in front of this massive aircraft carrier. And of course, they turned us over in its wake, or they sent out tugboats to pull us away. But there were many, many, many small actions like that, as well as mass marches. Something was happening every day. And I get tearful remembering it. And I think everyone who was part of that at that time does, and knows that they're not likely to be part of anything quite like that ever again, because there was a feeling of community and of common purpose that I haven't experienced since. The reasons that I haven't experienced it since are not because the U.S. has not launched horrendous wars, most obviously that in Iraq in 2003. I'm sure most of us were probably out there in the streets then. I was out there throwing myself at the federal building with everybody else. But there have been a number of changes since that time. I think one is that at that time in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, America was so prosperous that it was easier to afford to be engaged like that. Didn't cost a lot to live. Another is the retrenchment of the media. At that time, during the Vietnam War, people saw on TV every day horrendous images, and they were on your mainstream news networks, the NBC, ABC. You don't see that anymore, and the media has become more and more repressive. I've experienced this just since 2011. I was a journalist for a while, and then I went back to being a journalist in 2005 because I was so horrified by what I had seen happen in New Orleans during the flood, after which New Orleans was no longer a chocolate city. It was no longer a majority black city, and there'd been a major assault on its absolutely unique culture, which had always meant a lot to me. Then in 2010, I had reason to call Rwanda, the tiny East African nation of Rwanda. That happened because I'm a member of the Green Party, and someone who is a member of the Green Party had asked me to call and see what I could figure out about why they were unable to have an election. She said, you take a lot of interest in this part of the world, right? That was because I had started following resource wars, and particularly the resource war in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Although and I knew that Rwanda and Uganda were US proxies before the war in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and a lot of the minerals were smuggled out through those two countries to the major powers and the major industrial corporations. But I didn't understand what was wrong in Rwanda. They tried to have an election that year. I called and spoke to the Green Party candidate and to two others who were unable even to register their parties. Eventually, two of them went to prison, another went into exile, and I was most every week calling one of those who went to prison, Victoria Muhoza, who had returned from exile in Europe because she said she couldn't stand to see her people continue to suffer like they were under a brutal dictatorship, actually even totalitarian is the best word for it, that pretends to be a democracy. It has a sham democracy. Like a lot of other countries, it has a sham democracy every some years to make it look like a republic, a state that the U.S. is worth supporting. The U.S. had been behind Rwanda and Uganda for a long time. And I learned in that process, that the whole story about the Rwandan genocide was not the one that we're all told in the Wikipedia. It's a fiercely defended story with so many edit alerts that it's really impossible to change. You try to change it, and it'll trigger edit alerts, and hundreds of people will jump in to make sure that it's not changed. You have to understand how the Wikipedia works to understand what that means. But anyway, I had the honor of infuriating the Rwandan government, which wrote me up in their delirious newspapers many times. And eventually, Victoire went to prison, and I was given something called the Victoria Muhoza Democracy and Peace Prize by an organization of exiles in Europe, Rwandan exiles in Europe. This is given every year to people who participate in resistance and opposition to tyranny and resource plunder in the Great Lakes region of Africa. Several times when I was doing that, I made contact with Obang Metho of Ethiopia about the similarity between the TPLF and the RPF, which is the ruling party in Rwanda. At that time, the TPLF was still ruling Ethiopia with an iron fist. So I began to understand the Horn and the TPLF a little bit at that time. So somewhere in this chain of events, I became a contributing editor to Black Agenda Report. And after the war broke out, I told Glenn Ford that I was going to see if I could understand what it was about. And he said, yeah, I'm glad you're going to do that. Just don't be too kind to the TPLF. They're thugs. And I soon learned that they were right, that he was right. And of course, in following this, I became aware of Eritrea and eventually had the pleasure and the honor of traveling both to Ethiopia and Eritrea. And I said a lot about what I loved about Eritrea the other day when I spoke, and then Raina and Eugene spoke. So I don't think I need to repeat that. This morning, before I got here, I produced a little radio story, a radio news report. I report for the Pacifica Radio Network and some, most particularly for KPFA Radio in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I also work on a show, excuse me, that's heard in New York, DC, Houston, and LA. And I did a show I did a report about being here at the festival and how everybody's having so much fun, but that these sanctions, HR 6600 and Senate Bill, I think it's 3119? Yeah, 3119, are hanging over the festival. And my particular concern is that the proposal to impose social media censorship on Ethiopians and Eritreans. These are sanctions bills targeted at Ethiopia and Eritrea. There's more and more censorship going on, and as I said in my report, this proposal to censor the speech of foreign nationals is unprecedented. So I'll just leave it there.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. As it was said before, I am Eugene per year. I wear a lot of hats. I work with Breakthrough News for sure. I'm a national organizer with the Answer Coalition. I'm a Central Committee member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and just, a concerned person around many of these issues I think we're all concerned about in terms of imperialism's ongoing attempts to completely ravage and control the world. Maybe I'll say a little bit about myself and maybe say a few other things since I'm last on the panel here, and we'll go back around. And certainly I look forward to hear from you all. I mean, I've been doing work, anti-imperialist work, since about 2001, 2002. What really brought me into the struggle was the reaction of U.S. imperialism to the 9/11 attacks, the invasion of Afghanistan, certainly the unbelievable rise in racism and Islamophobia, and then, subsequently, shortly after that, also the Second Intifada and the struggle of the Palestinian people, which was and remains, always extraordinarily inspirational to me. And, then of course the war in Iraq in 2003 was a very formative moment for me, or the lead up to it, I should say, when I really started to engage in a real heavy level in organizing and trying to mobilize and fight back and see what we could do to end the war. Obviously, it still went ahead, but nevertheless, at that moment, I was really, I guess I caught the bug, if you will, in terms of the importance and the necessity of standing up when things are wrong. I mean, these are events and activities that, as horrible as they are being done, more or less in my name. That's how I saw it then and how I see it now, given that they say they're being done on behalf of the American people or by the United States, whatever that means. I think it's, on behalf of a tiny handful of people, less than 1% of people, who are the ones who really benefit financially and socially from it. But nevertheless, if someone is going to speak in your name and do horrible things, there's only really one thing that you can do if you are opposed to that, and that's to stand up and say that, in fact, you don't consent, and to try to find as many people as possible who agree with you and see what you can do to prevent these things from happening, to stop the things that are already in motion, and then to try to address the root causes that led us to that point, so you can put in place a state of affairs that can, not only drastically improve the situation, but hopefully prevent things like that from happening again. So a lot obviously has happened, between now and then. I won't go through my, whole long biography, but, I've worked, of course, on a range of fronts, both internationally and domestically, which I think is linked. I mean, we talk about imperialism so often vis-a-vis just the struggle against U.S. imperialism as a realm of quote-unquote foreign policy, but obviously it's deeply interconnected with the system of capitalism that is emanating from this country and the hegemony of U.S. capitalism that has stretched its tentacles all over the globe. So I've always seen the struggle, at home for working class people and oppressed people as deeply connected to the struggle for people worldwide seeking liberation and fighting against exploitation. So, if you Google me, I'm sure you can find out many more things about my background than I can tell you here, but thank you. I should have said at the beginning, and I'll say it here now, I'm really honored to have the chance to be here today and to speak with all of you. And I know some of us, we've had the chance to talk yesterday and, a little bit earlier in the week. It's tremendously gratifying, and I think it's, especially discussing in particular, not only the trip we were able to take to Eritrea, but the just broader role of U.S. imperialist sanctions and demonization and attempted isolation of Eritrea, I think is it's such an important particular example of a broader international phenomenon. We probably all feel it, that the globe is to some degree at an inflection point, that things seem like they are at a breaking point for sure, and that the traditional hegemony of U.S. imperialism is starting to slip. And certainly we can see that in the war danger that is in the actual wars that are happening, but vis-a-vis this new Cold War scenario, the U.S. confrontation and, fighting to the last Ukrainian to confront Russia, this absurd trip by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan and the provocations against China. I mean, we can see that not only is that's, in my sense, the clearest way you can see U.S. hegemony is slipping, because they're looking to and willing to use more aggressively, up to and including the threat and possibility of nuclear war, these sorts of policies in order to maintain their stranglehold. And I think, you know, when you're at a place, the U.S. has 4,000 nuclear weapons, could destroy the entire Earth 300 times over. And when you have that kind of reality and you're willing to use it, obviously you're very concerned about your ability to control the world. Your soft power is no longer working. And I think what has been happening to Eritrea is such a clear example of that when you really drill down a little bit in terms of the nature of why the country is sanctioned, why it's being isolated, why it's being consistently demonized. You know, when we came back from our trip in December, you know, I put out a piece that also included some of our interviews we were able to do there, called "Why the Sanctions on Eritrea Don't Make Any Sense." And you can read the article for yourself to get the whole essence of it. But one of the things that was, you know, most notable to me when I was doing my research, especially into the WikiLeaks archive, which is, you know, I can't really recommend any higher if you want to see like the real thinking of U.S. imperialism, because they certainly never expected it to be public. But, you know, it's the clarity that comes through from reading these cables is pretty straightforward. I mean, you know, you have the aggressive push by the U.S. at the United Nations and rallying every nation they could find against Eritrea because of that Eritrea wouldn't participate in the dismemberment of Somalia. That was happening at the time, 2007, 2008, and 2009. You have another cable, one of the ones that was most interesting to me, that said, well, you know, we have this problem with Eritrea because, you know, they're working with countries that don't share our quote-unquote values. And what did they mean by that? Well, the cable went on to explain that at the time, President Ahmadinejad was leading Iran, and there was a, you know, massive effort by the United States to isolate Iran, destroy Iran, strangle Iran, that Eritrea wouldn't participate in this isolation and strangulation of Iran. The cable went on to note that at the time where the U.S. was accelerating its attempts to isolate and destroy Venezuela, to demonize President Chavez, to actually, and they succeeded in this part, to keep Venezuela off of the UN Security Council, and all of these things to prevent the Bolivarian revolution from having a larger profile in Latin America and the world. Well, Eritrea wouldn't go along with that either, and in fact, you know, was daring to have diplomatic relations with Venezuela. You know, we could go on and on here, and I think the point is relatively clear, that the real reason why the United States hates Eritrea, wants to isolate Eritrea, wants to sanction it, wants it to be demonized in the mainstream media, isn't because of any of the, you know, propaganda that they have about how this is terrible, about how that is terrible, but Eritrea is not a willing participant in the U.S. desire to dismember and destroy any country that refuses to agree with its plan to completely dominate the globe, and that's dangerous. And, you know, it's clear enough when you see, I say it can't be about these things, but what they say, but it's clear enough when you look at the statistics, which is another piece of it. I mean, you just think about some of the things that are out there. I won't repeat everything I had in the article, but, you know, Eritrea has a higher life expectancy than Nigeria, which is the wealthiest country on the African continent. It's $1 trillion economy if you look at purchasing power. I said this the other day. I mean, it makes me happy for Eritrea, but very sad for Nigeria. But they say Nigeria is great and Eritrea is bad. You know, Rwanda, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, and, you know, it's the darling of every Western government. Rwanda is supposed to be the country in Africa that everyone should look up to. Well, Eritrea has a higher literacy rate than Rwanda. And Rwanda is supposed to be good, Eritrea is supposed to be evil. And we could go on and on. I mean, you know, the maternal death rate in Cote d'Ivoire is significantly higher than Eritrea, for sure. When you look at the number of people who have access to electricity in rural areas, Eritrea is outpacing countries even like South Africa, again, a very rich nation, when you look at it. So obviously, when you start to put these various different facts together, the two things don't fit. I mean, there's no way that you can say, well, we're demonizing Eritrea because it's the world's worst country, and then when you actually look at the statistics, you can see that Eritrea, with, you know, less than half, maybe less than a third, less than a fifth of the resources of these powerful countries that are in alliance with imperialism, is doing significantly better. And I don't think that's I think that's not surprising because, you know, from the point of view of imperialism, I think that in and of itself is the crucial factor and is the fear of a good example. I mean, I already said and I already spoke to the fact that Eritrea is essentially a regional obstacle to the broader plans of the United States and Africa, and an international obstacle to the broader plans of the United States and other Western imperialists in terms of the international agenda. But I think it goes a little bit beyond that, because, you know, I raised this the other day, you know, what is the true thing that is going to change and to shift the state of affairs in the globe vis-a-vis imperialism? That's the struggle of the masses of people around the world who are not benefiting from imperialism. And you look at a country like Ghana, which right now is having large protest against the attempt of the government to bring in the IMF, and you can see very clearly the contradictions there. You know, between 1990 and 2002, Ghana produced about $5.2 billion worth of gold. In that same time period, the government only received about $87 million. So if I'm a young person struggling in Ghana, thinking about how you're going to establish a new order, and you look a little bit to your east and you see Eritrea that's setting up contracts with international companies where they're going to get way more than $87 million out of $5.2 billion in gold, you might say, well, wait a second, what are they doing right? What can we learn from their struggle? How can we work closer with them? And this could be replicated in many different ways in many different countries, and the ongoing and really never-ending struggle of people all across the African continent and the world, you know, people are looking for those good examples. And if you have a good example for imperialism, it's a threat, and you have to crush it. And I think that's the reality of Eritrea. Not only is it a non-compliant nation vis-a-vis the plans of imperialism, but it's a good example for people all around the world who are looking to lift themselves up and are looking to improve their own lives and are looking for other nations that have done it and find a way to learn from them and learn from their struggle. And I think that's deeply, deeply dangerous in Washington and Brussels, and they have to stop it at all costs. And that's what's really behind the isolation and the demonization. So, but you know, I want to close or move towards closing on a maybe slightly more positive note. I mean, I've been saying all these negative things about what imperialism is doing around the globe and how difficult it is to struggle against it. And, you know, listen, it's one thing to say that something is hard. It's another thing to say that something is difficult, it's going to be hard to do. But it's important that we make an objective analysis of what's really happening and what's really going on in the globe. And the reality is that the vast majority of people all over the world are not benefiting from imperialism. And that's true outside of the United States, but it's also true inside of the United States, which is an underrated factor that a lot of people, I think, don't rate in terms of the possibility of the struggle. I mean, we're looking at a country here in the US that's going to spend in the next 10 years, roughly, probably more than this, $8.3 trillion in military spending. And this is also a country that passed a so-called infrastructure bill this year that they said, oh, we're going to fix all the bridges. And they couldn't even appropriate enough money to fix all the bridges that could collapse and kill people at any time. So to say you're benefiting from a system that's willing to spend more money destroying the lives of millions of people around the globe, but actually can't even fix the bridges that you drive over on a daily basis, I would argue that that system of capitalist imperialism is not actually benefiting people here in the United States, working class people at least, oppressed people, maybe a tiny handful of people, in the same way, in a different way, but in a similar essence as it's not benefiting anyone around the globe. Which is an important factor because it means that there's a broad mass of people who can be united around this struggle against sanctioning, isolating, and demonizing those countries that not only are standing up to imperialism, but are threats of a good example. And that the vast majority of people power has the ability to be sort of waged and leveraged in that direction. And I think ultimately that's the only thing that's really going to change the game, is for people all around the world to overthrow and to throw off the shackles of all these various governments that are doing the oppressing and doing the exploiting, and put in a very different type of system and a very different type of understanding of the way the world should work. So, you know, in terms of the actual material possibilities, I think there's so much there. Even though we're talking about U.S. imperialism, the most powerful force on the planet, the reality is, and I think many struggles, including the Eritrean struggle, have proven that, you know, the powerful, just having the most money or the most guns or the most weapons doesn't mean that you're going to win. Especially if you don't have the heart and the minds of the people, you can't win and you'll never win. And if we can win the hearts and the minds of the people and win them over to the struggle against imperialism, we absolutely will win, and we can do anything we want to do. Certainly we can remove the boot off the neck of Eritrea from U.S. imperialism, but I think we can remove the boot off of the neck of all oppressed people and exploited people if we want to. And that's why it was important for me to go into the journalism space, really, was quite frankly the information war and the information battles. So Finally, I'll just say this. I think for, those of us on a day-to-day basis, the biggest challenge in anything, quote unquote political, right, is how do you fit it into the context of the rest of your daily life? And especially when a lot of people are continuing to struggle just to, do what you need to do on a day-to-day basis. I think it's always important to approach these things, though, not by what we can't do, but by what we can do. And I have the pleasure to talk often with people organizing around different, issues all the time. And I always say, well, if someone tells you the only time they have is the 15 minutes between when they get off the bus and walk to work and the 15 minutes when they leave work and walk back to the bus, it's our responsibility as organizers to figure out how they can use that time to be productive if they're willing to and they want to. So that would in many ways be my plea to everybody here. I mean, I know many people are continuing to work and continuing to fight, and I don't have to give that to everyone, but to think about what you can do, not what you can't do. And to look for those who are already doing the work that you respect and go to them and tell them what you think you can do, what your limitations may or may not be, and start there and get engaged and start to dig in. Because there's a lot that we can do. I think we have a world to win, and there's many things that we can change if we're willing to act, but we have to take those first steps towards engagement. But I think, even events like this is a very good first step and an ongoing step, I know, for many of us in this ongoing struggle against imperialism. So I guess I'll just leave it there. This is probably a little all over the place. I apologize. But, maybe my other co-panelists have some comments, and then we could open it up and hear from people in the audience. But thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Wow, that was a great segment there. I appreciate you, Eugene. So he spoke multiple times about the threat of a good example, and I mean, I have to say, even just looking back in Eritrean history, just seeing what we were able to accomplish as Eritreans, and the message that sent to the world, and even more specifically to me, like through history, to teach me, like, hey, you can do this. You can fight imperialism. You can fight the powers that be and succeed and win. And I think that element of confidence, of understanding that you can do it if you actually, you can look at this giant monster, this big machine, this military machine that exists here in the United States and globally, mobilizing against small countries, and to see that, like, you can defeat that and liberate yourself and then, continue to develop. I think you have to have that. You have to believe in yourself. And so I think for me, it's so important. I feel a profound sense of responsibility as an Eritrean to fight, to continue this fight that we're on, and to, we have this entire infrastructure of resistance that we have built over the years, and we're at the cusp of something great. And I think that, being together in forums like this, at all these festivals around the world this year, I mean, just looking at what we saw in Europe, in Scandinavia, in UK, all the Eritreans mobilized, connecting with the different groups that are also fighting the good fight, and inviting them to our festivals and connecting with them like we are today. It's so important. And it feels like there's just such a profound sense of responsibility that we have to keep fighting and keep pushing and, trying to really defeat imperialism. And so it's, I feel as though, there are so many forces that want to convince you otherwise, that tell you that, you can't do it. It's not possible. That, Eugene talked about, the 15 minutes that you have to get to work and then back, and that's all you have. And it's, we've built an infrastructure. We've been organizing for so long, and now we can use this to help these people, help all, everybody that's, busy in their daily lives to essentially be able to, to participate in this struggle in an active way and develop ourselves against the forces of imperialism and succeed. And so anyway, I honestly, I can go on and on and on, but I really feel as though just this dimension of, like, believing in ourselves and having this profound sense of responsibility, and as Eritreans, we just can't give up, and we got to keep fighting. And so there's just I mean, I think, like, if we can maybe connect this to maybe, I don't know, like, I'm trying to think like if we should kind of center this on like the particular nations. I can speak of the Eritrean experience, but I don't know. Rania?
Well, I'll say this. I do think one of the biggest parts of the struggle against imperialism that is essential right now has to do with something that Anne mentioned, which is these sanctions bills that are sitting in Congress that could potentially be passed to add further sanctions against Eritrea and Ethiopia. And I think the issue of sanctions is so important right now because this is the primary method of warfare of the United States. Like the US right now is sanctioning something like a third of the world. That's insane. And sanctions is such a, it's like not even the right term to use because it's too clean. Because it doesn't give you the understanding of just how violent sanctions are. I mean, it's what the U.S. calls it is unilateral economic measures, right? That's not either. What sanctions are is it's warfare. It's economic warfare. I live in a sanctioned country. You guys have visited a sanctioned country. Most of you have. A lot of you go back to Eritrea. Lebanon isn't as sanctioned as Eritrea, but it is targeted with sanctions because it is home to Hezbollah, which fights Israel. And also Syria is under sanction. I spent a lot of time in Syria. These countries are being destroyed. Their economies are being ruined by these economic measures that Americans don't even think about or even know about. And I mean, what does that look like on the ground? You guys have seen it in Eritrea. It means no electricity. It means no internet. It means oftentimes you don't have the medical equipment you need to treat diseases that are totally treatable, and people die as a result. You can't get replacement parts for a dialysis machine. You can't get replacement parts for electricity infrastructure, for trucks, so that you can move food from one side of the country to another, so that people can eat. I mean, this destroys a country. It causes the currency to totally devalue so that people's wages and salaries become worthless. I'm watching it happen in Lebanon. It's completely devastating and destructive, and it causes this, flight out of the country. Everybody just wants to get out. In Syria, there was a war in Syria, which was like this regime change war that the U.S. and Europe and many of the Gulf states were participating in, arming and funding these Salafi jihadist rebel groups and calling them, moderate rebels and freedom fighters to try to collapse the Syrian government because the U.S. doesn't like the Syrian government. And so since that war didn't work and the Syrian government didn't collapse, the U.S. turned to economic sanctions. And my friends in Syria who are still there tell me that life under sanctions is actually worse than when people were shooting at each other, than when there was an actual war, right? Like that just shows you the impact that sanctions has, and that makes sense because you know what? Having electricity is better than not having electricity, even if people a couple neighborhoods away might be shooting at each other. Having electricity when it's scorching outside because it's summertime so that you can turn on the AC and sleep. I mean, when you don't have that, it's miserable. You can't live a normal life. It slows you down. You need electricity for modern living. I mean, I'm very passionate about this because in Lebanon, I have 13 hours of electricity a day, and I'm one of the lucky ones. And that's difficult to deal with. So I guess my point is to say that I think the issue of sanctions, especially as Americans, is something that we all can rally around. Whether it's Eritrea or whether your issue is, advocating against the blockade of Cuba or the sanctions on Venezuela, or Syria, because everybody kind of has their specific issue. Like these are all things that we can connect on because we're all being subjected to the same measures, and our government is doing it. And if more people knew about it, we could call our Congress people and tell them, say no to this sanctions policy. And so anyways, I just wanted to raise that because I really do believe, and I think probably Eugene looks like he has something, or Anne maybe has something they want to add to that or say to that.
Yeah, I might refer people to, yes, I might refer people to the Sanctions Kill website. I belong to this organization. I handle its Twitter feed. It's sanctionskill.org. And I didn't know a lot of the specifics about what sanctions do until I joined this group. One of the promising things now is that there's a lot more resistance to sanctions. And I think people understand sanctions better than they have because the sanctions on Russia have had such huge and crippling impacts all over the world. The other day there was a headline saying, surprise, surprise, that Russia and India are trading with one another despite the sanctions. There are other kinds of resistance going on. Probably most notable between mid-sized powers are the attempts between Iran and Venezuela to help one another. Venezuela has the largest oil deposits in the world, but it's heavy crude oil, and in order to refine it, they need to mix it with light crude, which Iran produces, and Venezuela also has a severe fuel shortage because they haven't been able to refine their oil. At several points, Iranian tankers went to Venezuela with light sweet crude and or fuel. And it was always very tense. Several times they got through. But there was huge U.S. military presence off the coast of Venezuela and in the Caribbean there than there had ever been. Another time, the U.S. stopped a carrier with $40 million worth of oil in it and just kept it. So the fight against sanctions is going to be a struggle, but people are fighting. Ready? Anybody else? Okay.
No, I think those are all good points, and maybe we could get ready to move towards opening it up, perhaps. I don't know how long we've been talking. I don't even know how long we have, 100%, so maybe I'll just go and, we'll see what happens. But no, I think that, all very well taken points. I think obviously the issue of sanctions is crucially important. I mean, it's one of the greatest moral stains, I think, on the globe right now, the fact that you have these unilateral coercive measures that, prevent people, no matter what they say about, oh, well, it's always targeted. That's just completely fake. I mean, everything about that is completely fake. The reality is when you look at sanctions, I mean, let's just take Eritrea as an example, right? When you look at a lot of the actual sanctions that are placed on the country, the way I always describe them to people, a lot of them are vague and scalable, right? So they will be targeting a wide swath of people without exactly, the few things will be picked out. They'll say, well, PFDJ is sanctioned. Okay, fine. But, that's a very broad statement. And in a country like Eritrea, obviously I think we all can see how you could manipulate and contort all sorts of just even basic relations with family members in the United States with their family members back in Eritrea as some sort of nefarious plot that violates sanctions. It wouldn't take a ton of creativity to do that. And that's the point, right? It's to create a chilling effect, certainly on the diaspora, which is directly targeted by a lot of these sanctions, but on people around the world. And so when you have these kind of broad, scalable sanctions that can be applied or not applied at various levels and at various times, it creates this sense of fear. And I've had the opportunity to talk to people all around the world about this, that things that are explicitly not sanctioned, oftentimes you cannot get in your country because the companies that sell them, they look at this whole thicket of sanctions, they look at the level of ambiguity, and they just think, well, you know what? Why would I ever want to get involved in that? Why would I want to sell this medical equipment to this country when maybe the Treasury Department is going to come behind this for some reason, somehow, some way, and manipulate it and ruin my business, by saying we violated sanctions and putting, their own legal consequences on us. So it has this huge, even, targeted aspects, like we'll say we'll sanction one person. But you look at oftentimes how they will say, oh, we're going to sanction one person, and the one person will be the one person who's doing all the negotiations to bring food into the country. So then you have the number one person working on the issue of bringing food into the country, and they're sanctioned. And so people say, well, I'm not going to work with that, and I might not even work with your aid, because if you meet with me and then you go back and meet with them, maybe I'm going to get in trouble. And so you have this whole atmosphere that's created, and that's why I say it's such a moral stain, because the way it's so often portrayed is, oh, well, these are just sanctions on whatever, terrible people, one individual, certain people who are doing bad things. They're only aimed at this, that, and the third. But really, they are, in fact, deliberately designed to create a chilling effect to make sure companies and individuals fear any interaction at all. Because the easiest way to avoid it, right, is just do nothing. The easiest way to avoid it is just have no engagement at all. And that level of chilling effect is exactly what they want to put into place with all of these so-called targeted sanctions in addition to all of the broad sanctions that are out there. And I think that's something that's important to realize, but also not for us to realize, but to explain to people, because the mainstream media is not doing that in any way, shape, or form, and in fact is complicit with that exact issue. I mean, this came up, I've seen this come up before vis-a-vis Cuba, where the New York Times and others will not allow people who are doing op-eds to write that Cuba is blockaded and that it prevents them from getting medical equipment. Now, anyone who does even the most basic level of research, including into the archives of the New York Times, you can find very easily that the blockade of Cuba is in fact preventing them from getting medical equipment. But what they will say, the editors, they'll say, oh, well, if you read the actual fine print of this or that sanction, it says they can send medical equipment. So the mainstream media isn't even thinking what actually is happening. They're thinking, well, what does the government say, and how can we act in a stenography kind of way to facilitate this narrative? So I think it's a really important element of sanctions to get to. And I'll also just go back and say one more thing, and then maybe we can open it up. But we had the honor when we were there in Eritrea to have a brief conversation with President Isaias. And, he made a similar point to the one I made earlier, which I think is relevant to, Eritrea's understanding of the world and the role that it can play in terms of a pivot point and a leverage point in the struggle against sanctions and the struggle against imperialism. And he said to us, he said, well, the real thing is, we don't want Americans to think that we have a problem with the average American, because it's really the 0.01%. I can remember that very vividly. He said it just like that. It was the 0.01%. That's who benefits from these policies. And if we can find a way to unite everybody else, both between the United States and Eritrea and around the globe, we have a lot of possibility. And I just want to reemphasize that point I made earlier, because there's so much devastation and so much destruction, but I think there's also a huge amount of possibility that's out there, through connecting people, organizing with people, people-to-people diplomacy, and people-to-people connections that can shift the balance of power and can shift the equation in the globe, no matter how difficult it is. And I think that's, when we talk about a threat of a good example, the other point I brought up earlier, I think that's another threat of a good example that they don't want to see. I mean, one of the few countries that actually put out a statement directly denouncing Nancy Pelosi's ridiculous trip to Taiwan was Eritrea. And that kind of, cross-country, cross-border solidarity between targeted nations and targeted peoples is another thing that they don't want to see, and certainly that they don't want other people to copy or to feel as possible without being totally destroyed. So just existing in a mode of resistance and showing that it's possible to do so, I think speaks to it, as well as the policies, as well as the history of the struggle. So I just wanted to sort of underline that point as well, which I think is crucial. But I do think that Raina and Anna are 100% correct. I think this struggle against sanctions is an amazing opportunity to link people together, all around this country and all around the globe, even though the issues can seem very, very different sometimes. The context can be very, very different. The essence of it is very similar. And I think it's important that we stand up to and say, especially here we are at this festival, loud and clear, that there's nothing nefarious, there's nothing illegal, there's no, negative aspect in standing up and saying that a country like Eritrea deserves to live and deserves to breathe and deserves not to be sanctioned, isolated, or demonized. And I think that so often that chilling effect that we see just in the most general sense often plays into how we ourselves advocate, and that we feel that we have to somehow be reticent about our level of advocacy because, well, we don't want to seem like we're playing into this, that, and the third. But the fact of the matter is, I think the targeting of the diaspora by a lot of these sanctions is deliberate, because it's clear to me, I mean, I lived in DC for 15 years, anyone who's lived in all parts of the country, Eritreans are an important part of the social fabric of our country and so many of our communities, and I think there's millions of people and hundreds of metro areas who are very proud at what you all do, and having the Eritrean culture be a part of our local communities and heritage and culture. And I think that it's super important that we insist that aspect gives many people here in this country the right to stand up and to speak on behalf of Eritrea, that it's not some illegal, nefarious thing, that in fact it's an important factor for the globe, and that the people-to-people communications and things we have on a local level could be so much bigger and so much better if we could get this boot off the neck and have it have more of a cultural exchange on an international level as well. And I think that's an important part of what we're being denied by the sanctions, the isolation, and the demonization, is the denial of the opportunity to have these kind of cultural exchanges like this festival that anyone in the Dallas area can come to at a higher level and a more important level. So I think from a human perspective, there's a lot to be gained from the struggle against imperialism and the struggle against sanctions, from what we can learn and teach each other about who we are and where we come from.
I just wanted to add that I think Eritrea's courage in, for example, refusing to vote to sanction Russia over the war in Ukraine, and what Eugene just mentioned regarding Nancy Pelosi's ridiculous trip to Taiwan, I think that they will make more people want to defend Eritrea.
And another thing, I think in addition to the issue of sanctions, I think one other thing right now that can unite all of us is this attack on us in terms of censorship. What's going on right now is, this label of being a disinformation agent. It seems to be the new terrorist. The thing is, if we're going to fight sanctions, if we're going to fight against imperialism, we're going to have to raise the consciousness of the people, and around the world, and to unite that 99.9%, right? And that requires the spreading of information. And if you're being labeled as a disinformation agent and being removed, from like platforms, and you're being, your algorithm is changed and all this stuff, so that your voice is not heard anymore. How do we continue to fight, imperialism and all these other, sanctions and all these horrible things? So I think that's another thing that can unite us. The three next to me right here are all journalists. And, journalism goes hand in hand with organizing. I think it's important, that they are very synergistic. And so we have to be able to come together against censorship right now at this very precarious moment where, people are just being deplatformed. And honestly speaking, from experience, just being removed from Twitter, in the middle of the night without any warning, and, just wanting to, you feel like you're on the cusp of something great, you built your movement building and all this stuff, and then it's just silence, So we have to be able to fight that. We can talk about creating our own platforms, but I think we have to be grounded in like the physical world as well. And so we have to talk about creative ways of fighting censorship, and maybe that's something, I don't know, y'all, if you want to speak on. Huh? Yeah. Actually, let's go ahead and open up to questions and then go from there.
I think we can do better than that. Woo! Right? So I'm going to be the ghost from the back. Thank you very much for the amazing presentation, your thoughts and analysis that you have presented. So our panelists have talked about a wide array of things, from how Eritrea has resisted, our history, and how we're still surviving regardless of what the West has been doing to us. So please come up. We have microphones in the middle of the stage floor, and anybody who has questions, please come up and line up behind the microphone.
Testing. Oh, it works. Hello, panelists. I have two questions. Going back to what you were saying about the world thinking that we are at a breaking point, I believe one of the panelists mentions that Russia and India are doing trade despite the sanctions.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's hard to hear.
Oh, sorry. Going back to what you were saying about the world thinking that we are at a breaking point, and I believe one of the panelists mentions that Russia and India are doing trade despite the sanctions. Do you believe that in the future we may be moving towards a world that works together and to help their respective economies prosper, rather than having a U.S. run a global hegemony? And my second question is that with countries that have suffered years of sanctions, like Cuba or even Venezuela, for instance, where inflation has ruined the national currency, will the path to economic recovery in a new world be a long or a short path?
All right, well, seeing no one else online, I'll just jump in and answer. And thank you very much. I appreciate the questions, and I appreciate also your kind words about following us at Breakthrough News earlier. The question, I will repeat the questions. The questions were basically, the first question related to the concept of the world being at a tipping point, the growing multipolar order in the world, and whether that creates or whether there is a possibility in a future in front of us with more global cooperation and friendship rather than what we see now. And then the second question was in regards to the impact of sanctions, the inflation crisis, the broader economic crisis we're seeing, and whether the road to recovery will be long or short. On the second question, economic prognostications are always dangerous, so I'm hesitant to say that much about it. Is it going to be long or short? I think the number one factor, I'll say this, I think about whether it's going to be long or short is whether whether or not the issues behind it remain. Certainly in the context of the crisis of inflation, that we're seeing all around the globe. It's being driven by the sanctions on Russia and the war in Ukraine. Where that's going, when it's going to end, how it's going to stop is going to play a huge role in that, especially energy prices, which is the number one driver, at least in the United States, Europe, and certain parts of Latin America and Africa, of this massive increase in inflation. And since a lot of the oil and gas is how you also produce fertilizer, also in terms of the price of fertilizer and the food crisis we're facing, I think the resolution to that will be very deeply rooted in what the resolution of that conflict is. And I think the sort of root causes of it are there. We also have the fact that we have to acknowledge that the Federal Reserve in the United States, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, are now deliberately trying to create an economic crisis to address inflation. They're raising interest rates. I won't get that much into it. If you listen to my podcast, The Punch Out, we've talked about this a lot. But the basic point is, when you have a huge inflationary crisis, there's really two ways you can deal with it. You can either balance the books on the back of the ruling class and the rich people, or you can balance the books on the back of the working class and the oppressed people. And raising inflation rates is basically balancing on the backs of average, everyday people. And it also gives more power really to capitalists over workers because it creates more competition for jobs and things like that, right? So that'll have a huge impact on the globe. In addition to the war, if the United States and Europe essentially engineer an economic recession and an economic crisis that I think will be worse than a recession, which will have huge ripple effects across the globe. And I think that speaks to that. So I'd like to say that it'll be short and that there will be good positive resolutions to all these problems relatively soon. But I think given the relationship of forces, we could be headed into a sustained period of serious economic troubles, I think, all around the globe in ways that could be, quite dangerous. On the issue of the multipolar world, I guess, yeah, I'd like to think so. I'd like to think that that's the direction that the globe is moving in, but I think the real issue that is underlying all of it is what is the basis for global cooperation, friendship, and collaboration, and it's not really like capitalist trade and commerce, you know what I mean? I think that the biggest challenge we have from the point of view of why there's so many wars all around the world and so many attempts by big countries to dominate small countries and so on and so forth is that this is the essence. It was, as he famously said by Clausewitz, right, that war is politics by other means. And so it's really the essence of how a handful of people want to try to enrich themselves around the globe that is driving all these different conflicts. So if a multipolar world is going to mean something different, I think it's going to have to be on the basis of a deeper underpinning. Because right now, I think that there's a double-edged sword with that, right? I mean, there's a lot of leverage created, especially for small countries, to have the ability to trade with India, with China, with Russia, with the ASEAN countries, and which is growing and continuing. It's opening up vast new possibilities and priorities. But so it has that positive sense too, right? But there's another side to that coin, that it also is increasing the level of competition between certainly the West and everyone else, because they fear the impact of this, right? The fact that, I mean, you look at so many of these countries in West Africa that have these huge imperialist military presences there. And you look at a lot of them, most of them, their number one trading partner already is China. So what is the essence of the military presence from the imperialists? Well, it's certainly not fighting terrorism or whatever excuse they've come up with. The essence of it is they're integrating that country's power structure with the imperialist military and saying, listen, we'll let you oppress your people as much as you want, and anyone who might oppose you or stand up to you won't be able to do so, because we'll be giving you unlimited weapons, bombs, intelligence, or whatever, so that you can stop them. And so it's a quid pro quo relationship, because they recognize that without that, the economic underpinning of neocolonialism is a little bit shaky. And so as that continues to accelerate as a conflict, I think it's very dangerous, because it means that more and more sort of conflict points are going to break out as the West seeks to impose itself vis-a-vis sanctions, vis-a-vis invasions, vis-a-vis military troop presences on any country or region that seeks to diverge from the status quo. So I think the real question is not is there going to be a multipolar world, and I'll close with this, but to speak exactly to your point about whether we can basically living on a better world where people are trying to live sustainably amongst ourselves and amongst the planet, is do we have not a multipolar world, but a different type of pole, a social pole, where more and more countries and the people who live in them come to recognize that doing everything just to make a dollar, just to make profit, is not the way to live sustainably between each other and with the planet in and of itself. And we have to have a different understanding of centering people's needs, the right to education, to healthcare, to housing, to all the crucial things that human beings need to survive, has to be at the center of the governing philosophy of all of the different infrastructures, however we set them up, if we want to move towards that kind of world. So I think if we can do that, which is a part of our struggle, then I think the answer is yes. I think if we can't, then we're also again headed into I think some dangerous territory where the world continues to bifurcate and to crack under the basis of this intense competition of the West to maintain its geopolitical peace. So there's an anti-imperialist element to the struggle, and then there's also a social and ideological element to the struggle that we also have to remember when we're talking about struggling against imperialism. It's not just about what you're against, it's also about what you're for in terms of what the outcome's going to be.
I don't know what the question was.
It was about multipolar. I'll say one thing, and then Eugene, fill her in on the question.
Multipolar.
Well, I just want to know, Eugene answered that masterfully, and I agree with everything he said. I just wanted to give just one example of the sort of benefit of multipolarity, at least in the short term, though I absolutely agree with Eugene that without an ideology to back it up, what does multipolarity actually mean? It could actually lead to a more chaotic world, right? Unless we have some sort of ideology of how we forge a path towards like a future that makes sense. Underpinning it, like Eugene said, which of course I think most of us agree here, is socialism. But just, very quickly, I think in the short term, there are so many benefits for developing countries, especially those that are being sanctioned. I want to give an example. Maybe benefits a strong term, but Syria is under these extreme sanctions. It's the most extreme sanctions, I think, in history. It's called the Caesar sanctions that the US is enforcing on Syria, which make it impossible even for Syria's neighbors to do any trade with the country. And so as a result of these sanctions that are so severe, Syria's entire electricity grid was basically built by the German company Siemens. And now Germany, the German company, is refusing to honor any of its contracts because you constantly need to update and maintain electricity infrastructure, power stations, distributors, generators, or it collapses and it doesn't work anymore. And so Siemens, because of the sanctions and that they don't want to be subjected to US financial penalties, which are quite large for sanctions, so they're not honoring any of their contracts to maintain any of this equipment. Give them replacement parts. So as a result, slowly over the last couple of years, Syria's electricity infrastructure has been being replaced by China. China has come in, and not all of it, but eventually, at this rate, essentially all of Syria's electricity infrastructure will be Chinese. But Chinese companies have come in and they're starting to replace some of that equipment. And just having that alternative, even though maybe it doesn't work overnight, is essential to some of these countries being able to continue to survive. I mean, if it wasn't for Russia, China, and Iran, Syria would have zero electricity. At least they have, like, I don't know, 10 hours a day. It's better than nothing. So I think that that's an important aspect of multipolarity. It definitely gives these countries leverage, and I think, Eugene's given some African examples of that. But I want to just second what he said, that this is why it's so crucial for us to agree. What do we want the world to look like? Do we want this capitalistic world that, is the underpinning of imperialism, that has us living in this horrible, unequal system where like 8 people own more average wealth than the bottom half of humanity combined? That's an atrocious figure. It should be scandalous. So we have to have those conversations about what kind of world do we want to live in. And, I think countries like Eritrea do provide an example of a sort of model that people can look to as, okay, this works. Okay, look at Cuba, this works. Okay, let's look at these countries and see what does work and what attributes do we want. And how can we all kind of collectively come together and push for that world? Otherwise, we're going to be in a really tough situation because it's just going to be powerful countries vying for more power. It's going to lead to more conflict, more proxy wars, more hot wars in a situation where a lot of these countries have nuclear arms, and the end result will not be very pretty if it gets to that. So, okay.
Yeah. In 2015, the U.S. was trying to, one way or another, overthrow the government of Burundi. And this was in part because they had charted an independent path, and they're at the eastern end in Africa of the China One Belt, One Road initiative. Another reason was that they had negotiated a contract to mine their nickel reserves. And by the way, cobalt, any mine has other minerals that are a byproduct of mining the main mineral they're going after. One of those is cobalt, and I'm sure everyone knows how important cobalt is to the new energy technologies. It's also absolutely essential to building jet engines. They had signed a contract with a Russian firm to mine their nickel. And if you study WikiLeaks about Burundi, you can see that for many years, for decades, somebody was trying to put together a Western consortium to go after this nickel. Didn't work. Burundi said that Russia had offered them a better price. Well, the U.S. was not able to overturn the government of Burundi. They did sanction it heavily. Now, they've finally more or less given up. The sanctions have been lifted. The African Union refused to invade Burundi, basically on behalf of the U.S. and NATO, who asked it to do that. And I think this illustrates one of the greatest benefits of multipolarity, that it gives resource-rich countries an opportunity to negotiate for a fair price. And I told the story the other day of Eritrea's gold mine, the Bisha gold mine, and how a Canadian firm was going to do the mining, because Canada is, by the way, the mining superpower of the world. A Canadian firm was going to use its technology to mine this gold mine in Eritrea, and the project was going to be financed by a German firm. The U.S. bullied that German firm into opting out. And then finally a Chinese finance firm stepped in, and eventually the Chinese firm bought the Canadian interest in the mine. But it's a fair deal. There are a number of calculations involved in the way the profits are divided, but basically it's a 50-50 deal. And Eritrea is sitting on the Arabian-Nubian Shield, which is a hugely resource-rich mineral area. And so this ability to negotiate with various sides in a multipolar world, and Eritrea's commitment to demanding a fair deal could mean a huge increase in the country's standard of living.
All right, yeah, I think we're good for another question. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, y'all. My name is Yoleon Ogbu. The question that I had, and this kind of goes back to what y'all were talking about in the context of the ordinary American isn't necessarily the enemy of Eritrea, right? And that made me kind of think about how at the end of the day, the enemy of all working class people and of states like Eritrea are the ruling class, whether that's in America, whether that's in Nigeria or Ethiopia, for example. What I find so unique about the national liberation movement of Eritrea is that national consciousness was necessary, but in order to achieve national unity, you had to have class consciousness kind of embedded in that work, whether that was EPLF, working to organize however many villages and committees of people and making sure that people from all backgrounds, every single tribe was involved in the struggle. And so what I'm thinking about in terms of moving forward and organizing the diaspora and making sure that these conversations remain at the forefront of fighting against imperialism, how do we ensure that we continue to talk about the class interests of our enemies rather than chalking it up to, say, tribalism? That tends to be the primary conversation in Ethiopia, right? We don't see that national unity because we have the ruling elite from several different ethnic groups fighting against each other to continue to, pit the working class Ethiopians against each other. We don't see that in Eritrea, and I feel like that needs to continue to be talked about, studied, and really investigated into why. And that's why I think that I'd love to get y'all's take and how y'all navigate that in the media.
No, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a crucially important issue, and I think that, the point that you raised in putting it in the Ethiopian context, I think is very important and very timely, I think, for us to also remember our history. Like, what was it really that drove the process of removing the TPLF from power, starting with the protest in 2014? I mean, the framework in which it's often presented to us, and there's obviously a truth and a reality to this, but that it was sort of like an ethnic revolt against the TPLF. But when you really look at the heart of what happened, I mean, you have these millions of Oromo people who initially come into the streets, and they were raising a number of different issues, and certainly they were raising issues of national oppression. But really at the core of the protest, and it was a very young subset of protest, was the issue of economic inequality, the lack of unemployment, and the nature of the TPLF's ethnic federal system in driving their inability, really to have any sort of economic mobility and to, any sort of economic development or whatever it may be. I say all that to say that it was really sort of a class mobilization. It was a mobilization of the masses of people. And what's important about that, and what I'm tying in here, is this was also the essence of why then hundreds of thousands of Amhara people came out in solidarity with the protests that were happening. I mean, unfortunately, this has been blotted out of history, even though it was very clear at the time. But for many people, it shocked the world to see, I think it was like 250,000 people who came out in that first Amhara protest come out throwing up the Oromo symbol and saying that they were in solidarity with, their brothers and sisters who were already out there struggling, and that they felt similarly that this TPLF system of ethnic federalism was in and of itself a deeply class oppressive system where they, a handful of people and their little foundations effort and stuff like that were hoarding all of the resources from all of the so-called development of Ethiopia and, using that only to, continue to enrich their own enterprises and their own capitalist owners while everyone else was going essentially hungry, without jobs, and so on and so forth, but doing it under the guise of this ethnic federalism, right, and trying to pit people against each other. So I raise all that just to say that I do think that is a very, I agree with you in terms of that point, vis-a-vis the struggle in Ethiopia and the levels of success it have had, and also the biggest challenges and why is it that imperialism thinks it's so important to continue to reinforce this hatred between the people of Ethiopia. I mean, I don't know, I'm not in behind closed doors, I can't speak about anything, directly, but it seems interesting to me that the second the TPLF appears defeated, the OLA, which represented almost nothing a few months before, now all of a sudden has hundreds more fighters and all sorts of weapons and is going around massacring thousands of people all across Oromia and Amhara. Well, that doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. The same thing with the TPLF in terms of how they look to divide people. It has the name of ethnicity, but it's really using ethnicity in the service of that same agenda. So maybe I'll just wrap up what I'm saying here and pass it to Simon with this point that I do think that there's a lot to be said and a lot to be learned from the Eritrean experience, and that goes back, going many years where these points were raised by the EPLF in the 1980s and even before in relationship to Ethiopia itself. But I think also in terms of our experiences in Eritrea and what Raina already spoke to, that it's very clear that a huge part of the social cohesion that exists in the country is because of the fact that there is a strong understanding that it's a people first, people's needs first oriented structure there. It's very, very clear. I mean, you look at it, many people talk about this. I think I was talking to a brother earlier who told me he was in Eritrea twice. Anyone who's been anywhere else really in the world who goes to Asmara, the thing that immediately jumps out at you, at least to me and I think a lot of other people, is that it's like 100% safe, which is, yes, I think that deserves applause, absolutely. Especially when you compare it to other, developing countries. Many places I love, but it's such a sad thing when you go to, I love Johannesburg, for instance, but it's unbelievable, the level of violence. You can't have that level of social cohesion amongst people in an atmosphere where it's a winner-take-all, hyper-capitalist, profit-first, profit-centered model of development. It just doesn't happen, because when it's dog eat dog, everyone out for themselves, the almighty dollar rules everything, that ultimately drives predation, it drives hatred, it drives division, it drives violence. And so I think that that's an important aspect of understanding why things like this aren't random. But the elements of social cohesion that exist are deliberately based on the reality of having a people-first approach to how you build an economy. So maybe the ultimate question is, and from I think our point of view of media, which I think was kind of the thrust, it speaks to the need for political education. I mean, the only way to keep things like this at the forefront is to be able to tell this history, to tell this story, to give the facts and the figures, to make the contrast between, this capitalist, profit-centered world and the countries and the nations that are putting people first, and analyzing how these are not accidental things. And if we want to see positive changes in the United States, if we want to see positive changes in any other country, it's because we're moving more in a people-centered direction, less in a profit-centered direction. And I think, as we've said here many times, I think as you made, the point you made very well from the mic early on, is this is something that we can learn and see in Eritrea from the history and from the contemporary reality, and that I think has a lot to offer to a lot of people, not just in other African countries and developing nations, but quite frankly right here in the United States, where, I live in New York City, so-called richest city on earth, and everywhere you go, there are people eating out of the trash and living on the street. So what does that say about the kind of morals and mentality of a capitalist system that we have to think about and overcome, and where we can learn from others, even in very different contexts, about how we can improve things? So I know, Simon, you wanted to speak to that as well, so I'll pass it on to you. But thank you for the question.
So I think it's important to understand that nations are like, it's a project, right? And it's something, we have this concept of nation building, and that you have to build a nation. It doesn't happen overnight. And nations, through colonialism, we know were imposed on Africa. And the concept of a nation goes back to the Westphalia Peace, 1640s, I believe it was, and that created the modern nation state. And this is the structure this is the global system today. It's based on these nation states. And so whether we like it or not, these are the structures that we have to adapt to and work with. And so because they were imposed through colonialism, and when we look at Africa, every one of them is a colonial construct. Even the borders of Ethiopia, if you look, those are all colonial borders. And so at the end of the day, within these nations, we're going to have to nation build. And when it comes to Ethiopia, you have multiple, all these different tribes, all countries in Africa, you have different tribes, different ethnicities, different religions. You can have all these sectarian issues, and you have to find a way to make it all work, and it's a process. And so I believe in the brotherhood of humanity, and we have to constantly keep working to build these higher order systems to get to, one people on earth. And so in that process, it doesn't make sense that we're going in the other direction and breaking down towards, the tribe, the clan, the family, and down to the individual person and saying me, 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 me. So we have to be able to build upwards, and it's going to take time. And so when we look at a country like Ethiopia, who are those who are pushing the sectarianism? Who are pushing, in Eritrea, same thing. We had that tendency during our struggle, and we had to stamp it out. We had to use organization, ideology, vision, all that stuff to stamp that out of Eritrean society. And so it's not like Eritrea was ready, like built and ready to go. It was a process, and it took time. And so people have to see that. And people like to look at this slice in time and say, oh, it doesn't work. Oh yeah, it's impossible. We don't have a choice. We have to fight. It is a struggle. If you don't see it through the eyes of struggle, then you're going to fail right away. So I think people have to struggle to build their nations, and we have to fight the tendency towards sectarianism, and you have to have a vision, you have to have an ideology. Without an ideology, it's not going to work. And so I believe in Eritrea, we were so lucky and so fortunate to have a principled leadership that had a very clear vision and way of looking at the world and connecting with the progressive movements of the world that were open-minded to accept whatever type of peoples and whatever type of nations, whatever type of tribes, whatever type of whatever. So that is these are the type of people that think like this that we're going to need in every one of these countries, Ethiopia, Eritrea, all throughout Africa, all throughout the world. And so the days of the past and moving that other way, I shouldn't say the past, you're actually seeing a world that's moving increasingly left and right, and the center is kind of, dissipating. And so that rightward tendency towards like your tribe or your race or whatever, it's something that we have to fight. We have to be united. We have to create a united front against this thing. And one of the things about I guess we haven't really talked about it with the No More movement, is like we are focusing on that and breaking down those barriers between peoples, and specifically and explicitly creating a united front against these tribalist, sectarian type of tendencies. And so we have to continue to struggle, we have to fight, and we don't have a choice. It's either that or we perish.
I want to add something to that. I just want to add, this is an ongoing struggle for obviously not just Africa, for all parts of the developing world. Partly because what both of you alluded to, right, is that imperialism tries to take advantage of these divisions that already exist. And it comes in, the US and Europe, they come in, they try to, they'll give money, or most importantly, they'll fund NGOs that explicitly try to divide even more. And so one thing I just wanted to note about Eritrea that I loved is that they've kicked out those US NGOs. There are no more US NGOs, and they are so destabilizing. All across the Middle East, they still exist, and they're so destabilizing, and they really do try to intensify those divisions. So having an ideology is so important, and it is an ongoing struggle because the US is always trying to find any way to go any division that exists, to try to utilize it to their advantage, to get people at each other's throats and to have that mentality of moving backwards rather than forward. So it's something you constantly have to think about, and Eritrea is constantly thinking about it. And, again, another one of those kinds of like examples for others to look to, I think, going forward. But anyways, another question?
So we do have one question before we wrap up. Sasen wanted to have the opportunity to ask you one last question.
I guess my question is a good concluding question. So I think it's great that you guys provided like a conceptual analysis and kind of the intersections or ways we can relate to other groups of people to kind of leverage those, the human connection in order to kind of achieve our goals. But just as important as understanding the concepts that you guys were explaining and the analyses, is actionable items that each of us can take in this room to leverage the human capital that we have here. So if each of you say one effective, actionable item that each of us can take once we step out of this room in order to achieve this vision that you're talking about and that a lot of us subscribe and opt into, I think that would be great. Thank you.
One actionable item. I would say, because there's so many. Yeah, it's hard. It's not easy. I would say join a party. Join a revolutionary party in the United States, or when it comes to Africa, a party with vision. I look at PFDJ and everything that it's doing, and I think it's very important to, have a vision. Like we have a national charter in Eritrea, the 1994 charter. We're headed in one direction, and it's very clear. It's a struggle, so it's kind of ups and downs, but we have a vision, and we're headed in that direction. And so I think it's important to join a party. So that's one thing. I could say more, but all right.
You're only allowed one. No, there are so many things we can all do, but since we were told only one, this is gonna sound like shameless self-promotion, but it's not, and I'll explain why. But one thing you can do is you can support independent anti-imperialist media. And you have two outlets up here on stage right now that you can support. You have Breakthrough News, which me and Eugene work for. You can go to breakthroughnews.org and you can donate to Breakthrough News. You can become a patron of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And it sounds like self-promotion, but the work we do to try to inform people about these issues is important. So we can go to Eritrea, so we can go to Ethiopia and do that on-the-ground reporting, so we can produce high-quality interviews to help inform people, so we can produce our podcasts and our journalism, our investigative pieces. All of this is crucial in building that consciousness that we need so people can become anti-imperialists in the first place. You can support Black Agenda Report, where Ann works, and she can maybe tell you where to go to do that. But again, independent media, this sort of media arm of the movement, if you will, which is what Breakthrough News' tagline is absolutely crucial to pushing these kinds of movements forward. So that's one item.
Raina sort of stole my fire there. That's what I was going to say too. And you can support Black Agenda Report at blackagendareport.com. There's the donate button. I think I would also recommend, as I said before, visiting the Sanctions Kill website, sanctionskill.org. We're open to participation of anyone else who's sincerely interested. Of course, opposing 6600, HR 6600 and 3199 are absolutely crucial for Eritrea and Ethiopia, and I'm resolving to just become repetitive about that. Whenever anyone asks me about Ethiopia and Eritrea, I am going to speak to 6600 and 3199. But as an action, you can become more broadly involved in the anti-sanctions movement, and sanctionskill.org is a good place to start.
There are a lot of resources about a lot of this information, but the key fact is to get it in the hands of people who don't already have it, and so that they can use it to push the struggle forward. So my one thing would be, have 5 conversations in the next 2 weeks with someone who you haven't talked to about these issues before, and share some of the resources that are up here in relationship to sanctions, in relationship to the struggle, in relationship to just information about countries like Eritrea and what's really going on there. Perhaps share your own experiences. But basically, we have to take the old, and it goes back to slavery here in the United States, slogan of each one, teach one, and we have to really be all about that. And all of us have much broader social networks than we ever think we are. So a lot of times we talk to our friends who we consider to be quote unquote political friends and family members, and that's about it. So that would be my one thing, and in a way a challenge to people. Looking at all these resources, everything you've heard here, the reasons that brought you to this event here today, have 5 conversations with 5 people you've never talked to this about before. Share some of these resources, share why it was important for you to be at an event like this with them, and in the conversation with the challenge for, hey, what can we do together to actually change this state of affairs? Because if we don't continue to view each of ourselves as an ambassador and a diplomat and an organizer that can change things, we're gonna fail. It can't be hoping someone else does it, it has to be us. So next 2 weeks, have 5 conversations, and I think you'll see more come out of that than you might expect. And thank you so much.
So thank you very much. I'm sorry, was there an answer someone wanted to add it? No. Okay, cool. So just to do the math, for all of us who know Dr. Gideon, if he was here, he would have told us what that speaking to the next 5 people would mean, right? So if there's 500 people here, tonight we'll have 1,000 people, right? So if one person speaks to 5 people, that's 2,500, and another 5, so those people speak to another 5, is 12,500. And so that's how we grow the number. So that's a very good point. Thank you very much. Let's give a hand to our great panelists. So just for your information, this has been recorded. It's a great resource. You'll find it on AliExpress. It's also been going live. But please share this information with everyone as well. So thank you very much. We are going to go for a lunch break. I think, yep, lunch is served. And let's meet back here. I'm sorry, is this really loud or is it me? Okay. Let's meet back here at 4:30, right? 4:30, half-hour lunch break, and come back for our next segment. Thank you.